In late summer 2025, a diverse coalition launched the Global Sumud Flotilla, a fleet of 45 ships departing Spain with a singular goal to break the Israeli blockade of Gaza. The word Sumud means steadfastness, reflecting the mission spirit. These were not warships, but vessels of hope, carrying humanitarian aid and a message of global solidarity. On board doctors, lawyers, journalists, students and politicians, united by the conviction that Gaza's suffering could no longer be ignored. Their journey was a peaceful act of civil disobedience, aiming to deliver aid and challenge the legality of the blockade. The flotilla's progress drew intense international attention, symbolizing a direct challenge to the status quo. For many, it was a courageous stand against a policy condemned by human rights organizations and the UN. The risks were real. Previous flotillas had faced force, but the participants pressed on, determined to make a difference. As the ships sailed east, they became a beacon for global conscience, demanding the world confront Gaza's humanitarian crisis. Their mission to remind the world of its responsibility to protect the vulnerable and uphold human dignity. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reverberate worldwide. On October 1, 2025, the Global Sumud Flotilla was intercepted by the Israeli Navy in international waters, far from Gaza's coast. Israeli warships surrounded the lead vessels, issuing warnings and demanding a course change to an Israeli port. The flotilla's organizers refused, insisting on their peaceful humanitarian mission. Israeli commandos boarded the ships, using force to detain the activists, who offered no resistance. The operation, carried out in international waters, sparked immediate controversy and accusations of violating maritime law. Israel defended its actions as necessary for security, but critics saw it as aggression against civilians. The ships were commandeered to Ashdod, shattering hopes of delivering aid directly to Gaza. The mission's abrupt end became a global flashpoint, symbolizing the clash between civil disobedience and state security. The world watched as the fate of the activists and the legitimacy of the blockade hung in the balance. The confrontation was more than a military action. It was a dramatic collision of worldviews. The participants' peaceful defiance was met with overwhelming force. The fallout would soon escalate into a major international crisis. With the flotilla seized, attention turned to the hundreds of detained activists from dozens of countries. Among them, Greta Thunberg and Mandla Mandela, whose arrests amplified the incident's global impact. Their detention transformed them into political prisoners in the eyes of supporters, galvanizing international outrage. For Colombia, the arrest of 2 citizens became a matter of national honor and a catalyst for diplomatic rupture. The activists were held in Israeli detention centers, facing lengthy interrogations as governments demanded their release. Israel announced plans to deport the foreign nationals, but legal and diplomatic hurdles delayed the process. Protests erupted worldwide, with calls for the activists' immediate release growing louder. The flotilla's mission to break a blockade had instead created a diplomatic one. News of the flotilla's interception and the detention of 2 Colombians triggered an immediate, furious response from President Gustavo Petro. He condemned Israel's actions as a violation of international law and an affront to Colombia. Petro announced legal action against Israel and called for international support. Most dramatically, he ordered the expulsion of all remaining Israeli diplomats from Colombia and suspended the free trade agreement. This was the final act in a long-simmering diplomatic feud, signaling a total break. Petro's decision was celebrated by supporters and pro-Palestinian activists, but criticized by opponents and Israel's allies. He framed the move as a moral imperative, not a political choice. Colombia's stance under Petro was clear. No more business as usual, with a government accused of crimes against humanity. The bold action positioned Colombia as a leader in the global south, willing to challenge powerful nations for human rights. The world took notice as Colombia drew a definitive line. Petro's expulsion of Israeli diplomats was the climax of a steadily deteriorating relationship. Since taking office, he shifted Colombia's foreign policy away from its traditional alliances with the US and Israel. The Gaza war became the centerpiece of this new orientation, with Petro emerging as one of Israel's fiercest critics. In May 2025, Colombia officially severed diplomatic ties, calling Israel's conduct genocidal. A small Israeli mission remained, but hopes for reconciliation faded as Petro doubled down. At the UN, he called for an international force to oppose Israel's occupation, a radical challenge to the world order. The US responded by revoking Petro's visa, deepening the rift. The flotilla incident provided the final justification for expelling diplomats and suspending trade. Petro's actions marked a historic break from Colombia's past, aligning it with a bloc seeking a multipolar world. For Petro, Gaza was a moral cause demanding an uncompromising stand. The consequences, diplomatic and economic, were secondary to the principle. The Global Sumud Flotilla's mission was born from Gaza's deepening humanitarian catastrophe. By October 2025, famine had been officially declared, with thousands dying from starvation and conflict. Over 67,000 people had been killed, most displaced multiple times, living in ruins with little access to food, water, or medical care. The blockade, tightened to a near-total siege, left aid convoys stalled and supplies desperately short. The flotilla aimed to deliver aid and force the world to confront the blockade's devastating impact. Activists hoped even a symbolic breach would challenge the blockade's legitimacy and increase international pressure. Their willingness to risk detention underscored the urgency of Gaza's crisis. The interception of the flotilla and mass detention of activists triggered global outrage. Protests erupted across Europe, with thousands demanding the activists' release and an end to the Gaza blockade. Governments whose citizens were detained, like Spain and Turkey, issued strong rebukes and launched investigations. South Africa condemned the arrests, calling them an attack on the global conscience. Even Israel's traditional allies urged restraint and adherence to international law. Palestinian groups denounced the operation as piracy and a violation of international norms. The unified chorus of condemnation left Israel increasingly isolated. President Petro's decisive action stood out as the most drastic diplomatic response. Colombia's move amplified the global call for accountability. Colombia's response must be seen in the context of its leadership within the Hague Group, a coalition pushing for legal accountability for Israel's actions in Gaza. Under Petro, Colombia became a leading voice, supporting South Africa's genocide case at the International Court of Justice. The Hague Group's strategy: use international courts, coordinate diplomatic pressure, and build consensus for a ceasefire. Petro's expulsion of Israeli diplomats was a bold extension of this legal campaign. The move aimed to increase Israel's diplomatic isolation and set a precedent for other nations. Colombia's actions demonstrated a commitment to international justice beyond rhetoric. As a key player in the Hague Group, Colombia sought to redefine global engagement with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The world watched as Colombia led by example. Colombia's expulsion of Israeli diplomats marks a turning point for its foreign policy and the global response to Gaza. The move elevates Colombia's status among nations critical of Western policy, but comes with economic and diplomatic costs. The suspension of trade with Israel and deepening rift with the US are significant risks. Petro is betting that moral leadership will outweigh short-term losses. Colombia's action sets a new precedent, challenging other nations to move beyond words. If others follow, Israel's diplomatic isolation could intensify, pressuring policy change. The long-term impact remains uncertain. Colombia could become a catalyst for change or risk isolation. On October 4, 2025, the world watched as a new diplomatic frontier emerged. President Petro's stand forced the international community to confront the cost of moral action in a divided world.